Hello, I'm Janette Fishell, and I want to thank the AGO for inviting me to make this very short presentation on the organ music of Camille Saint-Saëns in recognition of that composer's death 100 years ago. Enjoy. The organ is thought-provoking. As one touches the organ, the imagination is awakened, and the unforeseen rises from the depths of the unconscious. It is a world of its own, ever new, which will never be seen again, and which comes out of the darkness as an enchanted island comes from the sea. Camille Saint-Saëns was born in 1835 and died in 1921. Between those dates, the world experienced his brilliance as musical prodigy and champion of old music, influenced, no doubt, by his first organ teacher, Boëlly, under whose tutelage he developed a lifelong interest in Baroque music and a taste for the French classical organ. Titular organist at the age of 18, at the first of two Parisian churches boasting organs by Aristide Cavaillé, he was an inspiring composition teacher at l'École Niedermeyer, where he exposed his students to composers like Franz Liszt, someone considered too avant-garde by the French establishment. A great improviser and celebrated composer, Saint-Saëns was friend to many, but biting and caustic reviewer of others, and his popularity has survived and thrived. But what do we organists know of him beyond the organ symphony and transcriptions of his music by other composers, and why don't we know more? Part of the reason is that he didn't have organ pupils who carried on a specific Saint-Saëns tradition, and most significantly, he didn't leave a large body of repertoire, something that can be traced to his reliance on improvisation, his appreciation for organ music of others, which he regularly programmed at his recitals, and his highly successful and diversified career as a freelance musician. For Saint-Saëns, the organ transported one to an enchanted island, but those trips seemed to be periodic vacations rather than a permanent address. Let's begin with a short overview of his style and performance practice issues related to his organ music. The first thing to note is that his role in the development of the French school of virtuosity begs further investigation. The next example shows a toccata figuration that would become standard issue for later composers such as Victor Guilmant and Vierne. It is drawn from a later work, but these figures were present in his earliest period. Perhaps stemming from his time with Boëlly, who was called the French Bach because he was reputed to be the only French organist of his day who had the technique to play Sebastian Bach's organ music, Saint-Saëns was hailed for his virtuoso alto pedaling. This next excerpt would not be so challenging with heels, but a true legato would be due to the temperamental mechanical action pedal board. While requiring more dexterity, alto technique would allow the composer to literally sing through his feet. Organists like to have rules to follow, let's face it, and for most of the other French Romantic repertoire, we have a fairly good understanding of what those registration rules are. Not so much for Saint-Saëns, who is very sparing with his indications. This is particularly a problem in his fugues and fugatos, where crescendi and diminuendo are indicated, but no stop indications. The bibliography has some good resources on the typical Cavaillé organs, their tonal and mechanical properties. This information should lead the way as one devises a logical registration plan that seems to capture the spirit of the composition. Two forces are at work in his compositions: improvisation and an interest in classical forms and processes. One sees why he championed composers such as Mendelssohn, for this classic romantic label we apply to the German composer is apt for Saint-Saëns as well, something that garnered him more respect than love at times from his public and some colleagues. This classicism can be seen in choice of form and process, such as theme and variation, ternary form, trio, fugue, fugato, etc., but also in his approach to touch. He often includes highly specific articulation markings. In this opening gesture from the B major fugue, for example, his use of rhythmic figures and articulation provides strong grammatical accents on the strong part of each of the two big beats, and lightness on the weak part of each beat. This is a wonderful example of the nuanced approach he took to touch, neither brittle, overly staccato, nor monotonous, continuous legato, but a rainbow of articulations that color the lines as effectively as volume does at the piano. And finally, to borrow an idea from Laukowic's comparison of German and French Romanticism, a certain simplicity of expression seems to be a hallmark of Saint-Saëns' style. This, coupled with just the right amount of romantic sentiment, will provide a good roadmap for reaching sincere authenticity in one's performance. And now we will take a quick look at the first of three periods during which the composer wrote organ music. In each, there will be score examples from the public domain, which you can easily download, and recorded examples taken from the wonderful recordings listed on the discography. I commend these to you. I hope you'll purchase these wonderful discs, as well as familiarize yourself with some of the books and articles cited. I will introduce one easy to intermediate piece and one more difficult piece in order to give everyone something they will find useful. The first period includes his harmonium works, which were trailblazing in their day, but due to time restrictions, we will consider only two solo organ works from this period. The first piece is a beautiful romantic adagio, useful, as he says, for elevation and communion, no more difficult than the Vienne pièce en style libre, and it's notable for the pianistic flourish on the last page, à la Franz Liszt. Here we see clearly the common ground between the organ and piano idioms in Saint-Saëns' work.
We next hear two excerpts from a work composed for the dedication of the Cavaillé organ at Sainte-Marie, a recital he played just before resigning to take the much more prestigious post at La Madeleine. In ternary form, the first A section looks like a toccata, but it is quite gentle, the chordal echoes showing the breadth of the organ's foundations. The B section is a stirring march that leads to an equally sturdy fugal section.
This work would be popular throughout the composer's lifetime and remains in the repertoire today. I'm intrigued by the fact that on the same inaugural recital, Saint-Saëns also programmed an extract from an unidentified Mendelssohn organ sonata, and I can't help but notice the similarity between the B section of the Fantasie in E-flat and the last movement of Mendelssohn's Fourth Organ Sonata, with its opening march leading to a filato. Je reviens, I return. The composer returned to organ composition after nearly 3 decades to write his most difficult and, in his own estimation, his best organ music. The 2 sets of preludes and fugues are crowning achievements in the form, and while both collections are well worth your attention, I believe Opus 99 is the more winning of the 2, so it will be the focus of this section. But before that, I also want to commend his beautiful Fantasie in D-flat major, Opus 101, another mature work well worth your investigation. And another easy work to add to your collection is the Marche religieuse. Who doesn't need another good postlude?
Let us now hear excerpts from the moderately difficult E-flat prelude, a toccata needing more verve than nerve, and a piece that is clearly in the same mold as similar pieces by Gigoux, Boelman, and Dubois. This barn burner is paired with a stately fugue, the calm energy of which pairs nicely with its effervescent partner. It has a wonderful sense of growth throughout and leads to a satisfyingly grand conclusion. The E major prelude and fugue is my favorite, a gentle, expressive divertissement. It features a lilting melody, sometimes developed in trio texture, and arpeggios in contrary motion that make you very glad you practiced your Hanon exercises.
This is paired with a lyrical sostenuto fugue, reminiscent of similar fugues by Mendelssohn and Brahms, and perhaps inspiration for a young Marcel Dupre's Opus 7 fugue in F minor. And now we come to the final period in which the composer is reputed to have said, "I am much too busy to get old. There is simply no end to my interminable career." But before the inevitable end came, he wrote a few more works for organ. Of note is his Opus 157 that represents the third work in this form of the Fantaisie, making it the only one to be part of every style period. Another lecture comparing these three works would be quite fascinating for another day.
What is most important to point out about these works is that at least some show that, despite his reputation as a reactionary, Saint-Saëns was not immune to new influences. These can be seen in the adoption of freer forms, the use of church modes and exotic scales, and some loosening of his classical approach to voice leading. Here is a brief excerpt from the first of 7 improvisations showing his use of the radical whole tone scale.
Throughout his life, Camille Saint-Saëns subtly changed colors, so perhaps it's more fitting to consider him a chameleon than a dinosaur. In his youth, he looked toward the past for inspiration. As a young composer and teacher, he was appreciative, to a point, of the Weimar avant-garde school. And in his latter years, he found himself embracing some degree of change, even as he penned biting prose about the folly of firebrands like Stravinsky. We end with an excerpt from his 7th improvisation, Opus 150, which makes small demands on the player, but is sure to please as a postlude or lively addition to a recital. And while it does not tread new ground, perhaps it represents best how this remarkable musician lived up to the adage, "What's new is old, and what's old is new." Out of step with the radical voices of 1917, he was happy to go his own way, not caring if his new music was a continuation of the old ways, and providing an invitation even now for us to investigate this new old music, perhaps for the first time.